Welcome to Office Hours. Fraser and Milo extend their greetings. Enthusiastically in Milo's case. This is actually not the last Office Hours, although it is the Office Hours associated with the final lecture of the course. There will be another Office Hours probably about a week from now, but in any event, I will let you know through all known media when exactly that is. Speaking of Fraser and Milo, there was a lot of turbulence this week involving Fraser and Milo. Milo continued his quest to dethrone Fraser as alpha dog, and at one point I actually got a little concerned because he did actually mount the throne. And I was afraid that things would get out of hand. As it happened, Fraser did successfully rebuff that challenge, but I realized that, that we were approaching a dangerous level of instability. So I decided to stage an intervention. I decided that really nothing short of spiritual transformation on the part of both dogs would do. And it worked out surprisingly well. Here's what happened. Excuse me, dogs. Why don't you let your Buddha natures emerge and live in peace? Given any thought to that? Wow, it worked. Milo's going to meditate now. By the way, if you're wondering why Milo was meditating with his eyes open in that last shot, well, actually some Zen meditators do meditate with their eyes open, so apparently Milo will be studying under a Zen master. I guess that's a decision he's made. Now, footnote, if you pay close attention to that last shot where Milo was meditating, you will see on the floor a scrap of paper. If you're wondering what that is, it's this. It's this. Formerly a part of this book. And if you're wondering how did they get detached, the answer is Milo, only days earlier, had, as kind of a first step toward eating the entire book apparently, had chewed this off of the book. This is actually true. Milo had done this. So, what we have here is one day this dog is destroying Buddhist texts, and the next day he is following the Dharma. And that just shows you that, spiritual transformation can happen like that. Or, as in my case, it can happen very slowly and never be finished. In any event, this leads us kind of to some questions that some of the students have raised this week. Okay, so Simona Holstein has a question of particular relevance to me, but probably to a lot of you as well. She writes, Dear Buddhists, in some Buddhist traditions, and especially in Zen, there's this attitude not to analytically explain terms such as no self and emptiness, in order to allow the meditators to learn this through experience, which is the real learning. Do you think that analytical understanding might be an obstacle towards reaching this understanding? Neil King replies that actually in some Buddhist traditions, analysis is emphasized and valued. In others, he says it is discouraged in preference to a sheerly experiential apprehension of these ideas. In any event, what I would say is certainly too much analysis during meditation can get in the way, I think. And that's a kind of a chronic problem for me, in part because I'm kind of in the business of analyzing this stuff and both writing about it and teaching about it. And it's kind of hard for me to forget about that sometimes when I'm meditating. I would say, though, I hope, because if I'm wrong, then I'm really not spending my time productively. If I'm wrong about this, then I'm actively doing damage maybe to the world. If I'm wrong about this, I like to think that there is ultimately value in analysis in the following sense. for me at least, my motivation to practice is strengthened by my belief that the practice is valid in the sense of moving me closer to the truth, closer to a clear perception of the everyday world, and closer to morally defensible behavior. Okay? And I didn't reach that conclusion by taking a Buddhist's word for it. I reached that conclusion through analysis, and including some of the analysis that I've shared with you in this course. So for me, taking a very close look at these ideas and comparing them with what psychology and our understanding of evolution have to say about these matters has been very valuable to me, because it's actually convinced me that the practice is worthwhile. This leads very naturally to another thread that occurred in the discussion forum. So Lorenzo Rubio started out by saying, with the provocative assertion, Buddhism was an amazing guess made 2,500 years ago, but the truth is evolution. And then he went on, said some other stuff that provoked replies, predictably perhaps. So Alexandru Mizeranci or Mizeransky or any of several other pronunciations says later in this thread, if we follow the takeaway message from Professor Wright's course regarding Darwinian Buddhist enlightenment, do you think it ultimately matters whether one chooses evolutionary psychology or Buddhism as their path? To which Kula Aggi or Sula Aggi, or in any event, Culaggi, replied, does evolutionary psychology even propose a path to freedom from all kinds of grief? I thought it was an analytical study of mind and mental processes, not a guide to freedom from suffering. Alexandru then, no, this is from K-Min, K-M-I-N, possibly not the person's real or at least entire name. In any event, says, as far as I understand, Darwinian enlightenment, coined by the professor, means the removal of all kinds of biases and distortions, the vestiges of human evolution, in our perception of the world. Okay, so I think maybe I must have failed to make myself entirely clear, possibly because I wasn't clear on some things in my own mind. In any event, what Culaggi, or choose your pronunciation, says is true. When I think it's a she, judging by picture of a very, very young child, presumably younger than this person, says, I thought it was an analytical study of mind, meaning evolutionary psychology, not a guide to freedom from suffering. True. Evolutionary psychology is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. It is not a path. And that actually leads to how I got interested in Buddhism. When I finished my book, The Moral Animal, I was more conscious than ever of kind of the biases and distortions, and in particular moral biases that afflict us by virtue of our having evolved. But one thing I noticed is knowing about these things did very little to help. It was no prescription. In some ways, it just made life more painful, because you didn't kind of become like a better person, or you could. The self-consciousness about moral biases, I think, can lead to improvement, but it can also just lead to, in a way, more suffering, because you're more painfully aware of the sort of deficiencies of perception and behavior. So one way to put it is I felt I had found the truth, but not the way. Jesus said, he said various things. I am the life and the truth and the way. Anyway, I am the light and the truth and the way. I'd have to look up the... Anyway, he said truth and he said he was both the truth and the way. Okay, I'm back, and through the magic of technology, I now know exactly what Jesus said, at least according to the book of John. He said, I am the way and the truth and the life. So anyway, the key things here are truth and the way. I kind of felt that with evolutionary psychology, I had found the truth, at least pending further scientific progress. In other words, the most plausible theory, so far as I could tell, but not the way. And that is, why meditation is interesting to me. It promises to be the way. It's interesting. Looking that quote up reminded me of that immediately after that, Jesus says, "No one comes to the Father except through me." In other words, Jesus is the only path to salvation, belief in Jesus. The reason that's interesting to me is because this book I'm writing about this stuff, I had thought about calling The Truth and the Way because it gets at kind of what I see as the relationship between evolutionary psychology and Buddhist meditation. On the other hand, the way, in addition to that title sounding really annoyingly grandiose and pretentious in the eyes of some people, no doubt, there is the problem that the way suggests there's only one way, and I wouldn't suggest that. I certainly wouldn't suggest that Buddhist meditation is the only path that gets you roughly where I would like to go. A lot of meditative traditions, and for that matter, therapeutic traditions. There are a lot of ways to kind of improve your perception and your behavior. But in any event, I hope this helps a little to clarify what I see as the relationship between a kind of Darwinian worldview and a Buddhist worldview. I see, to some extent, a division of labor between them, and so Darwinian enlightenment, by that I mean, suppose you just knew nothing about Buddhism, but you saw what kind of filters and biases have been put on our perception by evolution. What would then your conception be of clear vision? What would your conception be of enlightenment? And then to what extent does that correspond to what a Buddhist means by enlightenment? That's what some of this course has been about. Okay. Linda Shepard, who I guess gets credit for asking this question via both Twitter and Facebook, says, I wondered why there seems to be no mention of serenity in the concept of not self, unless I missed it along the way. To me, that word holds great appeal and suggests a calmness we don't seem to achieve these days without some thought and effort. Well, I certainly think people who have had the kind of full-on not-self experience, I have heard this, I think some of them, people who say they've had that experience would often describe it as involving serenity, peace of mind, and so on. What I would attest to is just that, kind of everyday meditative practice can involve that. And I think it's important that it involve that. There is, because it's one thing that keeps me coming back and practicing every morning. And, there's a lot of emphasis on how you should meditate with no expectations and not seeking anything in particular. And there's some truth to that, because seeking a particular experience can get in the way. At the same time, let's be realistic. People who are meditating are generally doing it for a reason. There's generally something they want to get out of it. It helps to have something that sustains the practice. And in my experience, getting to a point of serenity, however brief, every morning is something that can keep you coming back. And what's interesting to me is that the moment of serenity can also be a moment where you see, yourself as seeing things clearly. In other words, the moment where you're just viewing your breath after, for me, 10, 15, 20 minutes of meditation, finally my mind has quit wandering and the distractions are subsiding. And I get the sense that I'm just my breath. I'm just observing my breath. That can be a not really peaceful, pleasant moment, and also a moment apparently of clarity. There's a sense that, or a bird song or anything else. There's a moment of feeling that you've kind of stripped away a lot of the accretions of history, our entire evolutionary history, and then my personal history, all the history that informs the way, the narratives we spin about our perceptions and the likes and dislikes we bring to our perceptions. I don't want to suggest that we can necessarily strip away all those accretions. There is this kind of theoretical question that Lita Cosmides brought up in the course. Well, wait a second, is there such thing as a view from nowhere? She's an evolutionary psychologist, and she raises that question. It's a good question. I'm not sure there is. But anyway, you can strip away a lot of the junk. And it's just interesting to me that this feeling of serenity can coincide with the feeling that you're actually seeing clearly. And that's positive reinforcement and can keep you coming back. And that's a moment I was kind of alluding to in the last lecture when I said that one thing even the naturalistic version of Buddhism can involve, is the sense of contact with the actual truth. I mean, the sense of contact can get deeper than that, I'm sure, deeper than just the sense that I'm, seeing my breath clearly, but that it can be a very powerful feeling. Okay, I think I've said enough about that. Okay, now we come to a moment of great controversy. There's a controversy in the discussion forum over whether there was something wrong in Lecture 6. Now, of course, people never admit that they've done something wrong. So there couldn't be something wrong in Lecture 6. There could be something misleading in Lecture 6. But for there to be something wrong in Lecture 6 would mean that I did something wrong. And people don't do things wrong. I mean, other people do things wrong. But you don't do, you and I, we don't do, right? Okay. So that's going to be my argument. There was something maybe misleading in Lecture 6. And it came when Gary Weber, who's a really interesting person, in part because the depth of his everyday, the distinctiveness of his everyday perception of the world has been to some extent scientifically confirmed, as we discussed in the thing. In other words, his brain, when he's just not even meditating, looks like the brain on this one particular dimension that the brain scan captures, looks like the brain of somebody who's in deep meditation. That's one reason it's very interesting to me. Anyway, we were talking about what I call the exterior version of not self. In other words, a sense, not just a sense of looking inward and going, wait a second, there's nothing there, that's a self, but sense of looking outward and going, wait a second, the bounds between what I think of and myself are not so distinct. They're actually very porous, and there's actually an interconnection between the stuff in here and the stuff out there, right? And I wanted to drive home the kind of moral implications that can have, in the sense that it can actually, this apprehension of interconnection with the world can, as a practical matter, reduce people's incentive to do bad things to things out there, since after all you're interconnected with them. Okay, so that was kind of my agenda. Now, but in the course of that, Gary said the following. You perceive it this way, that everything is all one thing. This is a cliche, a mystical statement, but it really is perceptible. You can deeply sense that everything is all one thing. This got Gary and me in trouble. Lisa Dale Miller wrote in the discussion forum, Buddhist philosophy does not espouse oneness. Interdependent co-arising, or the theory of emptiness, implies that nothing exists independently of anything else, not that all phenomena are one. Oneness is a Brahmanical concept. By Brahmanical, well, for very rough purposes, we can substitute the word Hindu, since everyone kind of has a sense of what that means. Let's just say that, even though there are a lot of things that Hindu can mean, still. Oneness is a Brahmanical Hindu concept associated with the existence of a transcendent separate self or Atman. Okay, she's right. She's actually right. And I didn't, so to say that everything is one would, at least if you look at kind of mainstream Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, to say that everything is one would not be consistent with that. So in that sense, what Gary said is misleading. Let's see, where do I go from here? Because, to try to drive home the distinction, well, let's just go back. Let's do intellectual history. So there is this idea within the Hindu tradition that Atman equals Brahman. Atman means self, right? You may recall from lecture 2 or 3. Brahman, well, Atman in the Hindu tradition, you can think of self or soul. Okay, an individual's kind of, maybe soul is the best way to think of it. Brahman you can think of as this kind of universal soul, maybe. Again, this is all very crude and misleading, not wrong. No, I don't think it's too misleading. But it's rough, okay? Brahman, universal soul. There's this idea in Hinduism, Atman equals Brahman. In other words, we are all part of the universal soul. Your soul is a manifestation of this universal soul. Kind of a reassuring idea, and was an idea apparently prevalent in the Buddha's day. And the conventional thinking is that the Buddha went in kind of exactly the opposite direction and said, not only is Atman not Brahman, Atman doesn't even exist. Okay, I don't even buy this idea of Atman. This idea of a distinct, coherent, persistent self or soul. And so that's the distinction Lisa is getting at. To say that everything is one sounds like this Hindu idea that, you know, there is this substantial self and it's one with everything else. Whereas, no, I think the way she'd put it, and I think the way it is put in Mahayana philosophy, as for Theravada just doesn't work. I think doesn't emphasize this philosophically. It's not that they have a different view. It's just that it's not so emphasized. But anyway, the idea in Mahayana philosophy is that yes, there is continuity between what's in here and what's out there, but that's because, in a sense, there's nothing of substance in here and nothing of substance, you know, out there. That's where this concept of emptiness comes in. There's nothing with essence out there, and what we think of as a self doesn't have essence. So maybe you'd want to say, you know, describe that concept by saying everything is one because there's continuity, but it's a continuity of emptiness, not a continuity of fullness. Okay, that's the distinction. Again, roughly speaking, we're getting at. Now, here's what I would say. So actually, later, Gary says something that's closer to that. Later in what was in the lecture, he says, you know, I say to him, so it's like you identify with everything. And he says, he basically says no. So he in a way backs off of the interpretation that that people are objecting to as not being Buddhist, in a way. When I say, so you identify with everything, he says, I don't identify with anything. I mean, there's nobody here to identify with me or anyone else. In other words, it's empty in here. He says, quote, it's just an empty, still presence here, which is there. So there he's kind of saying there's emptiness here and emptiness there, and that's where the continuity is. I think that phrasing would be closer to what's meant, but or at least what Lisa would like to hear. Probably not exactly what she'd like to hear, but anyway, it's closer. But what I want to mainly say is I didn't bring him on to articulate Buddhist doctrine. I brought him on to describe the experience of this dissolution of the bounds of the self, the meditative experience, which I think is so consequential, and to talk a little about how it changes the way he looks at things. So that was all I was up to. He was meant to be a witness to experience and not to doctrine. And in fact, there are lots of Buddhists in good standing who, when they have this experience, if you ask them to describe it, that's the other thing. I should have mentioned as, who else, my notes are kind of messed up here, but Holly June Graves notes that Gary actually is in some ways a fan of what we can call Hindu philosophy, and that's true, and I should have noted that he's eclectic, he's not exclusively Buddhist. On the other hand, he studied for years and years and years in the Zen tradition of Buddhism, and I think he believes his current perspective is to a large extent a natural outgrowth of that and largely consonant with that, but I'll let him speak for himself. Anyway, where was I? I think this is where I was. A lot of Buddhists who serious Buddhists and are pretty steeped in the prevailing philosophy, who, when they describe the experience, the initial experience of the dissolution of the bounds of the self, they're just not too picky about how they describe it. They say, like, anyway, let me just say this. My main point was to describe how it feels, how it can feel when the bounds dissolve. Now, once the bounds have dissolved, how exactly you describe that is kind of a pivot as to whether you describe it in the Hindu way or the Buddhist way. And that is a genuine distinction. But I was trying to get at the experience. So Avik Mitra gets at what I was getting at when he says, as part of this discussion, are we talking only about subtle semantics or direct experience? Experientially, if one finds oneness and another finds interdependent co-arising, which is quoting something that I think Lisa had said, then can one claim that one has monopoly over enlightenment, nirvana? So he's getting at this distinction between kind of experience and doctrine, but in defense of Lisa, she's not, I think, saying she has a monopoly over the truth. She's not being dogmatic here. She's not saying that her interpretation is right and the one she attributed to Gary was wrong. She's just saying they're different, and as a matter of philosophical clarity, we should recognize that, which is true. But again, it's very hard to describe the experience I was talking about without lapsing into talk that seems to attribute substance or essence to whatever. Anyway, sorry. I've got on. Do I sound defensive here? Is that why I've gone on for like 3 hours on this? All of this gave me an interesting idea. And I think this is going to annoy the people who are annoyed by Gary, even more than Gary annoyed them. So let me try this out. What I thought for the first time was, okay, you've got the Hindu idea of Atman equals Brahman, the soul is a manifestation of the world soul, universal soul. Then you've got this Buddhist and especially Mahayana Buddhist idea that, no, the continuity is better described of a continuity of emptiness. And I realized for the first time that maybe the meditative experiences that Hindus have that seem to affirm their description of things, and that Buddhists have that seem to affirm their description of things, maybe those meditative experiences are essentially the same. Maybe the same thing is happening in their heads, even kind of biochemically, and maybe it's fundamentally the same apprehension in some sense. Now, it may be different in terms of conceptual overlay. It may be that the tradition they've come up in affects the interpretation, but maybe the experience is fundamentally the same. And I guess I might suggest that the real question is, does it lead to the same kind of behavior? If it makes both of them more considerate of their fellow beings, that's great. And I don't think the people who complained about what Gary said would necessarily dispute that. Again, they're not being dogmatic as far as I can tell. They're just asking for intellectual clarity. But it could be that it's the same experience, same moral implications, and who am I to say which one is the truth? I don't. Again, this is why I say I would never say any one way is the way. There are a lot of ways, and for clarity of vision to be reached. And for my money, one of the main gauges of clarity of vision is, does it lead you to treat other beings the way they kind of, in some sense, deserve to be treated? Does it make you a better person or not? And by the way, you could say the same thing for mystical experiences in the Abrahamic tradition, where people would describe it as union with the divine. Christians, Muslim, Jews might have these kinds of meditative experiences, describe it as union with the divine, and maybe it's fundamentally the same thing. And again, if that leads to good moral behavior, then I would say, more power to you. Milo, on the other hand, sounds like he's getting ready for a walk, and I certainly have gone on long enough. So I'll give you your weekly shot of Milo up close. Milo, could you just pose a second? Let them see what the enlightened Milo looks like. Okay, you'll note the difference, right? You see the difference now that he's following the Dharma? Look at that. Look at the wisdom. See, look at the wit. That's what I mean. Look at that. See? And he's so non-judgmental. See, he's just kind of looking with curiosity and interest. He's not judging me. He's just saying, Bob, if we don't go for a walk pretty soon, things are going to get ugly in this household. But that's not the same as being judgmental. Okay, so enough. Now you understand why there was something misleading, arguably, but not wrong, in Lecture 6. Okay, so there will be another office hours. And one thing, I want to get back into a couple of things. This question of Buddhist activism, which continues to be raised. In other words, does the Dharma kind of sap your activist energy, or can it? And the related question of, I've been throwing around moral truth, good, bad, and I did in a lecture, and, there is this question of, wait a second, can you talk about moral truth from a Buddhist perspective? Don't you transcend the whole conception of good and bad? These are good, important questions. I want to get back to those too. This is one reason we are going to do another office hours. But also because there will be ongoing discussion in the forum, Facebook, Twitter, even though the course per se is over. So we'll have at least one more office hours. And we will check in on the dog's spiritual progress. And I will let you know when exactly. I mean, probably a week from, probably on Monday as usual, and office hours will show up. In any event, I will let you know through all known media. Thank you so much for continuing to talk. Please keep it up so that I'll have an excuse to do this next week. See ya.